Chapter 14 is wireless. We talked about some of the advantages in the last video about the 2.4 versus 5 gigahertz. Talked a little bit about the spectrum broadcast methods used, and about CSMACA, or carrier sense multiple access collision avoidance, that's used by wireless networks or Wi-Fi networks. I'm going to start off with this. I left off at this point. This chart here that you've got here is something you should commit to memory. It's going to help you both in an exam along with real-world ramifications. So let's go to the history of Wi-Fi a little bit. Started in 1997, 802.11. It was a 2.4 gigahertz frequency, direct sequence spread spectrum, networking technology. Its speed was 2 megabits, range is 300 feet. Now, when we talk about range and wireless, keep in mind that range, the range is your maximum distance in an optimal setting. But also, when it refers to speed, as a general rule, the closer you are to your wireless access point, to your AP, the faster you're going to be. So at 300 feet on this 802.11, you probably didn't get 2 megabits. Wasn't very long after that 802.11b came out, and its big advantage over 802.11 was the speed. It was actually could handle 11 megabits per second. It was not necessarily backwards compatible, but it didn't need to be. It was actually faster, and it worked a little better. Within a few months of 802.11b coming out, 802.11a came out, was released, and 802.11a is a 5 gigahertz frequency, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing wireless network. Big advantage of this one was its performance. 802.11b was 11 megabits, 802.11 is 54 megabits. The big disadvantage was the 5 gigahertz radio. It not only gave you a shorter range, but it didn't penetrate walls as well as 802.11b. And they were not compatible with each other. So you had to make the choice, 802.11b or 802.11a. The market clearly went towards 802.11b. 802.11a was kind of a niche, had a niche market. Not a lot of people used it. In many ways it was better technology, but again, market forces chose B largely due to cost. The cost of 802.11b was substantially less than A. But people who were using B really didn't like the performance degradation they had. So late 90s, early 2000s, 802.11g was released. 802.11g was a 2.4 gigahertz frequency Wi-Fi network. It also operated at 54 megabits, and had its range of up to 300 feet, and all the advantages of 2.4 gig. Penetrated walls easily, superior coverage in terms of distance. Keep in mind it did have some problems with that 2.4, microwave interference, cell phone interference, walkie-talkies. A lot of things interfere at 2.4, but in a lot of offices it was okay. But remember, the one disadvantage also with 2.4 is only 3 non-overlapping channels. So in crowded spaces, that was a problem. 802.11g also had another advantage over 802.11a, was its backwards compatibility to 802.11b. In and of itself, you think, hey, that's a great deal. I got 54 megabits when I need it, and I'm backwards compatible too. 802.11b, it wasn't quite so easy. If you put the 802.11g into compatibility mode, you really lost a lot of performance. You basically had to listen to an 11 megabits network. So yeah, you could technically run at 54 megabits, but because you had to listen to that for that 802.11b, you really slowed down and really ran at 11 megabits. Then along came 802.11n. And several years after 802.11g was released, 802.11n was entered into the market. Now 802.11n had some advantages over all its predecessors in several areas. One, it supported both 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz antennas. It had its performance of up to 100 megabits, and we'll discuss that in just a minute. And it had some nice distance and range in there, again up to 300 feet. Again, 300 feet using 2.4 gigahertz. So in legacy mode, we actually sent out, we took a performance hit. We took out to support those older devices. So that's going to happen. When you support the older, slower devices, you're going to take a hit in performance. So one of the options we did have was to use greenfield mode. And that greenfield mode only supported 802.11n devices. Now, one of the things you had with N, even though you can support 2.4 and 5, typically we use this to support one or the other. Again, you just had the advantage of 2.4 or 5. Sometimes you could, it wasn't unusual to see them both, but some organizations supported only 2.4 and some or 5. You could mix them a little bit and still get a performance increase, but a lot of times went to greenfield and supported just one frequency. And again, and remember, you do take a range hit with 5 gigahertz versus 2.4, but with 5 gigahertz, you're better off in terms of interference. Now, one technology that was introduced with 802.11 was multiple input, multiple output, or MIMO. And this allowed us to take antennas and bond them together. So that's what actually gave us our performance increase. So you take these channels and, for example, the 20 gigahertz channel or 20 megahertz channels, 20 megahertz channels in 2.4, you could bond channels 1, 6, and 11 together and actually get three antennas working at the same time, or 3 channels working at the same time, to bump your speed up. And on the 5 gigahertz range, we could really get some nice speeds. Some of the 802.11 networks on 5 gigahertz were boasting up to 600 megabits per second. But in 2.4, still wasn't bad. We could get 150 megabits without much of a problem. Several years ago, 802.11ac came out. Now, 802.11ac only supports 5 gigahertz frequencies. It does do some fancy work with the radios in there, so a little more power, and you can get up to a 300-foot range, but you still have the issues with penetration of walls, etc., of the 5 gigahertz. But the nice part about 5 gigahertz is you got a lot less interference. Keep in mind, remember, we had 40 channels in 5 gigahertz, and the FCC's opened up even more bandwidth in the last couple of years, so it's soon to be more than 40 channels in the 5 gigahertz range for 802.11. So remember, no backwards compatibility with AC. AC also came with a new technology called multi-user MIMO, and this allowed us to broadcast to multiple users simultaneously. So again, really nice feature, gave us really high-speed networks. You can get up to 1 gigabits per second in 802.11 AC, and it works really well. Now, in terms of design, you've got to watch out for the backwards compatibility. 2.4 is still used in a lot of organizations. You got some your old cell phones, old tablets, old laptops that still use 2.4 frequencies. So if you're going to use 2.4, remember you're going to have to use 802.11n or 802.11g or even back to 802.11b. B is kind of hard to find that anymore. You'd have to have some really old technology for that. But 802.11n is not unheard of, or even 802.11g. So keep that in mind. You have to have that to worry about. The other thing about the 2.4 gigahertz radios is the number, the non-overlapping channels. So if you get into an area with high density, a lot of office buildings, an apartment complex that just kind of squeezes people together, you can get a lot more interference at 2.4 gigahertz. Also keep in mind 2.4 gigahertz, the other non-wireless devices that will interfere with it. You're going to get microwaves, you're going to get walkie-talkies. A lot of things operate in that unlicensed 2.4 gigahertz range. So keep that in mind in your design. Also keep in mind the weaknesses of 5. 5 doesn't penetrate walls well. So if you need, you're going to need a lot more access points. And that's just something you have to live with to make that change. So how do we go about setting these up, our wireless access points? There's actually 2 different methods we can use. One is called the Wi-Fi Protective Setup. Or WPS. WPS allows you to connect devices without an interface, without a keyboard, using only the wireless network. WPS, we're looking. There's two modes. One is the push button mode. And 2 is a pin method. In push button, you're going to push a button on your access point. And another, button on the device. And this will cause the devices to configure themselves. Keep in mind here, you have a time limit. You can't just press the button on the access point and walk away for 10 minutes. There's depends on the manufacturer, but you've got maybe a minute to press the button on the access point, press the button on the device, and let the negotiation take place. So it's read your manual, get on the internet, find the instructions for the push button mode. I've used it quite successfully with D-Link and Linksys wireless access points. I haven't seen it in a corporate access point environment, so I can't say I've ever seen this work with like an Aruba or Cisco access point. The second method is your pin method. In the pin method, this is where you're going to connect a PC to an access point. And in this method, you also you may not have the credentials to actually attach it to the AP. So you're going to use the WS button. You're going to press the WPS button on the access point. Be sure to locate the SSID, and there will be an 8-digit pin number They'll act as the wireless access point's personal shared key. I've never used this method. I've read about it. Unfortunately, I just have never used it. So keep that in mind. I'm going to guess it works. I wish I could tell you I've used it. I can't say I've ever used it. It's supposed to be very easy to use, but it is susceptible to attack. So this is supposed to be very easy to use, but it is susceptible to an attack. So. So what other options do we have, or what else can we do with Wi-Fi? How do we connect? How does this work? And what kind of security options do we have? By default, accesses in the factory don't have any security enabled. So that's your responsibility as the network professional to actually set this up. So when we talk about wireless security, we're talking about network or wireless hardening. And we have three ways we can secure a wireless network. The first is MAC address filtering. Remember, we talked about MAC addresses. Remember back in the early parts of the semester, we talked about MAC addresses, and did say that ideally every MAC address is unique in the world. We did talk about also mention that you can actually program your own MAC addresses or enter your MAC addresses depending on the operating system, but you could do that. So keep this in mind. MAC address filtering is one way of doing this. Basically, you permit the MAC addresses you want on your network, and you exclude all other MAC addresses. Another way we can secure wireless networks is through authentication. Authentication basically says, I'm going to force a username and password, and that will authenticate the system. Other methods of authentication include certificates, 802.1x authentication. There are other ways of doing this. So authentication, basically, you're saying, is this device allowed on my network? And the third thing we can do within our wireless network is to encrypt data. Remember, this is over the wire, over the air. So anyone with a receiver can actually capture data out of the air. So if you're actually out there transmitting data on a wireless network, if you don't encrypt it, anyone can read it. So we encrypt that data to hide that data from prying eyes. So MAC filtering and authentication secure access to our network. So remember that they just permit authorized devices on our network. Data encryption secures our data. And we use all three methods to secure our access point. Typically, we don't use all three together. Two of the three is what we usually use. It's very rare to use MAC address filtering and another means of authentication together. So MAC address filtering is one way of referring to this is we create an access control list. And in an access control list, we're going to whitelist acceptable MAC addresses. And all of these MAC addresses can be on our network. So that's not the most effective technique. Keep in mind, many operating systems let us change and create our own MAC addresses. So if I'm out there monitoring a wireless network and I see MAC addresses in the ether, if you will, I could easily go out there and say, oh, take my laptop, tell the laptop that its new wireless card is this MAC address, and if this is the only method of access control you have on a wireless network, the laptop will then authenticate right to the network. So with authentication, we only allow users or devices with proper authentication to access or join the network. One of the protocols we use within authentication is 802.11i. This uses a radius server and a password encrypted with the extensible authentication protocol or EAP. So in authentication, we only allow users or devices with proper authentication to access or join the network. One of the protocols we use is 802.11i. This uses a radius server and password encrypted using the Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP, to grant access to the network. Within the way this process, the 802.11i works, a radius server is needed for storage of username and passwords. A radius server is one of the servers we had in our AAA authentication. We talked about AAA a couple chapters back, so just keep that in mind. Client software is needed on on our wireless device. This software is called a supplicant. And then we need the wireless access point to access the network access server. So the access point, actually the access point, and then the access point is the network access server. Remember we had the NAS back in a couple chapters ago? So the way this process works, we have our access point here. Oh. The way this process works, we're going to have our access point. So our access point will sit here with its antennas. We have a laptop. Or some other device, cell phone, whatever, some other wireless device. We're going to connect both of these using the PPP point-to-point protocol. Remember this access point. Remember this access point also acts as a network access server. And out over here on our network, we have a radius server. And this radius server is running our EAP software. And then connected to our wireless access point, we might have some kind of a switch with network resources we want to connect to. So these are network resources. So our device, our laptop here is going to try to connect to this network. It's going to authenticate to our, that's a P, it's going to authenticate, well, it's going to connect to the access point. From the access point, it's going to actually enter its authentication credentials. In this case, it's just username and password. Once we get onto this network, the access point will then be authenticated. Once we authenticate, and we are good, the access point then can make requests down here to our servers and get access to these network resources. And keep in mind, network resources might be the internet. So it doesn't have to be a server on your network. It could be just something they want to get to the internet.